I'm being pointed at. I think that means I should start. Hi, folks. My name is Adrian Ludwig. I'm the lead engineer focused on Android security here at Google. As you may have seen earlier today, we put out our annual report on Android security. It's about 49 pages, lots of text, a few graphics in there as well, giving an overview of the entire year. I've read it lots and lots of times. Folks on our team have read it lots and lots of times as we've been putting it together. But I suspect there are some people out there that aren't going to read the whole thing. So our goal here today is to sort of go through some of the key elements of the content and talk a little bit about what we've been doing over the last year. So I will dive into that. I will say, before I even get started, I know there are over 200 questions that have been submitted already. So the plan here is to go through content, take about 40-45 minutes, and then I should have about 15 minutes or so to go through questions. I think, if the folks in the room here can confirm, we can take new questions as we go. So hopefully we'll hit the 300 or 400 mark by the time we get there. Probably won't get through all of them, but I'll try to get through as many as I can. Okay, so with no further ado, this is the second annual report that we've put out. One of the key things that we think about at Google when we're thinking about security is our overall strategy and how do we accomplish making the most secure platforms possible. And a core element of that is building trust into the products themselves, and I'll talk a bit about that. But another element that's really important as well is making sure that there's transparency. There's sort of a truism in security that you should trust but also verify. And so we rely on the transparency that we provide about our own actions, about the features that we're building, even at the core of the product by making the product open source, providing transparency into how it works so that you can verify what it is that we're doing. We use it day in and day out to guide our own efforts, and we hope that you'll do that as well. So if you only have 5 minutes, these are some of the key highlights from what I'll be talking about today. We'll go over some of the changes that we've made to Google services that run on Android, the growth in the protection to users, as well as some of the specific changes that we've made to make those protections more effective. From there, we'll go into some of the details of the changes that were made in 2015 in the Android platform itself in order to provide enhanced security and to respond to some of the issues that we found and how we can make sure that we find and fix issues more quickly. Then we'll get into what I think of as the heart of the year in review, which is what are we actually seeing out there in the world, what's the data look like, what kind of exploitation are we seeing, what kind of malware are we seeing on devices. So we'll get into some of the specifics. Overall, the year frankly looked quite similar to 2014. We did see a slight uptick in the attempted installation of potentially harmful applications, but all in all, we stayed at levels that were pretty similar to last year. About 0.15% of devices that download apps only from Google Play ended up with a PHA installed on them in 2015. The number was higher outside of Google Play, about 10 times higher. And the result, when you average it out across the entire ecosystem, is about 0.5% of devices had evidence of PHA on them at some point during the year. The last thing that we'll do is go into some of the specific examples. Security often is dominated by stories, and so we'll talk about some of the stories. Those events that were large enough that they received a lot of discussion. We'll give you some of the data that we have behind what happened during the events as well as the follow-on to them. So with no further ado then, we'll sort of dive in and start talking about some of the details. So the first thing the report goes into is the changes that we've made to Google's security services. Important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the services that we provide to Google is that they are incredibly large. We have over 1 billion devices that are using them on a regular basis. We conduct, on behalf of users, over 400 million device scans in a fully automated fashion behind the scenes to make sure that devices are keeping their security up to date. Out of those scans and other ones, we end up checking over 6 billion applications every single day. So the quantity of information that's being used to help understand what's going on in the Android ecosystem is immense. That means that the vast majority of our capability has to be purely automated. And we go into details in the report sort of on the scale in terms of tens of thousands of CPU cores, gigabytes worth of RAM and terabytes worth of memory and storage that are being used to analyze applications on a daily basis. The overall size in terms of how many applications we're looking at across the ecosystem and how many we've seen. So some of that information is in there. But I think the takeaway in terms of scale is we've really got to focus on technologies like machine learning and event correlation that can operate in an ecosystem where you may have very good visibility. Being able to understand what you can see is really the challenge. So this slide is an overview of the architecture for Google's security services for Android as it stands in 2015. There's lots of words on here. There's lots of boxes. I would encourage you to grab the report if you're going to spend a lot of time studying this and try to understand what the various pieces are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into some of the specific areas that are most relevant. The key here is the things that are in the bottom left are actually running on Android devices, right? So those scale out to about over a billion devices that have those components on them. And then the things that surround in the upper right, Google Play, application analysis, Google services, and safety net analysis are on the cloud. So we're going to start by looking on the on-device components and seeing some of the changes that were made this year. Or really, I guess, last year. We're now a couple months into 2016. We'll finish working on the report. The first major component in terms of security services for Android is what we call Verify Apps. Verify Apps, to put it most succinctly, is built-in, free, broadly available antivirus and anti-malware for all Android devices. It's part of the core Google mobile services, so any device that has any Android application on it, or any of the Google applications on it, Google Play, Gmail, etc., is going to have Verify Apps. What does it do? It scans all of the apps that are on your device. It checks them prior to them being installed, and then it checks them sometime in the future as well, providing users with warnings if there's something that we classify as a potentially harmful application, or potentially if we consider it to be dangerous, we'll go ahead and actually remove it in an automated fashion and let the user know about that after the fact. So this is at the core of how we're able to provide protection against potentially harmful applications. One of the big changes that we made, that's a user-facing change, is what the user experience look like when we provide a warning. We want to give users the ability to decide, but we also want to make sure that they really appreciate the information that we've provided, because we think we have a very good understanding of what's going on in a lot of these applications. So the changes that we made to the user experience in Verify Apps reduced the installation of potentially harmful applications outside of Google Play by about 50%. Each time we displayed a warning in 2015. Another thing that we did in 2015 was launch safe browsing for Chrome on Android. It had previously been available for those devices that had network acceleration turned on, where the data was flowing through Google services. At this point, it's enabled for all users of Chrome on Android, so hundreds of millions of users are seeing this. Where we're providing protection against phishing, malware, social engineering. One of the more interesting aspects when you think about how Chrome interacts with Android is if users are installing applications from outside of Google Play, we get 2 bites at the apple. There may be an opportunity for Chrome to warn the user, hey, you're on a site where there are potentially harmful applications, and then even if the user chooses to move forward, they might receive another warning through Verify Apps. So we've got a lot of places where there's multiple layers of protections that are being put in place to help protect Android users. The next thing that we want to talk a little bit about is Safety Net. Safety Net goes beyond simply looking at websites or applications and begins to look at the whole range of potential threats that could originate in the software on an Android device. So this is a very broad capability. One of the key technologies that we put in early on is something that we refer to as exploit detection, where when a vulnerability is patched on Android, we patch the issue, and we also add logging related to that patch. So we can see on a device that has been patched a log created to indicate if there's an attempt at exploiting a device. So this allows us to use through SafetyNet and through analysis of those logs, patching of devices as a means to understand how much exploitation is going on out. Canary in the coal mine or any mechanism for monitoring as many devices as we have. It's not perfect. We may miss some instances of exploitation, but it does give us very good visibility into whether exploitation is happening at large scale and gives us the ability to understand what types of activities are going on out there in the wild. Another thing that we've done in SafetyNet is begin to look at network level attacks. So doing things like looking at how traffic traverses the network, whether SSL is having parameters modified in it, and we talk a little bit in the report about some of the data we've seen there. To be perfectly blunt, through SafetyNet, we haven't seen that much exploitation at this point. So it's not a very exciting read. If what you're looking for is lots of evidence exploitation and huge amounts of SSL tampering taking place in the world, we haven't seen that. But we're looking at scale, and it's something that we're very interested in keeping track of in the future. We'll talk more about the data here in a little bit. Another thing that was launched in 2015 is an API to give developers the ability to use our understanding at Google of the integrity of devices. So one of the interesting characteristics of Google in the ecosystem is because we have broad visibility, we have a fairly sophisticated understanding of whether a device is a compatible device, meaning did it go through compatibility testing that Google provides to manufacturers? Did it pass that testing? Is it currently in the same state in the wild as it was at the time when it went through that testing? So we use that information in our own services, such as Android Pay, to determine whether or not the integrity of the device is intact and whether it's appropriate to do financial transactions on that device. So that's an API that we made available to all developers in 2015. We began to see some fairly significant adoption both in the payments space. We've some enterprise and MDM adoption, and there's some consumer applications that really are interested in the integrity of the operating system as well. And so that's an API that we began to make available just last year. Another thing that we've done over the last year is used our ability to scan applications that are submitted to Google Play to look for potential vulnerabilities in those applications. So not only do we look for applications that might behave badly, but we look for applications that are well-intentioned, that are trustworthy applications, where the developer might have made a mistake. And so we scan through and try to find those issues, and then we notify developers about them. We notify them both in the context of Google Play, and we also do email to the developer that's a registered user of Google Play. So they see it both in the developer console and potentially in their email. We provide them with guidance on how to fix those issues, and then we actually have an enforcement mechanism through Google Play policy, so those applications need to be updated within about 90 days. And no new applications can be submitted that have the same issue in them. And so over time, we think this is going to be a very effective way for improving the software quality across all applications. We're not concerned just about the core of the operating system. We really want to make sure that the entire ecosystem is safe. And so we're using our services to provide that as well. Last year, we had over 100,000 applications that were fixed. We've already launched this year, not to preview next year's report, but we've already launched a number of these this year, and when we started to see even more applications being fixed. So this is something that I'm really excited about this program. I think one of the things that's interesting in working on Android is we have the opportunity to affect so many different parts of the ecosystem, and the interaction with developers who are building applications is one of the things that I'm most excited about, because I think ultimately that's going to be really critical for the ecosystem, and it's something that's unique about how Android's interacting with its ecosystem compared to other platforms. So we touched on a number of different improvements that we've made into Google Security Services and talked a little bit about the impact that they've had. I do want to mention most of what I talked about was focused on the client side. We don't have a ton of time here, so I'm not going to get a lot of time to go into details of a lot of the changes that were made on the server side. The report does include some description of a few of these technologies. Things like Our correlation engine is referred to down in the bottom right-hand corner there as ACE. System integrity check, it's SIC down in the bottom right-hand corner. These are some of the technologies that are relatively new that I think will, in the long term, give us the ability to have very sophisticated understanding of the types of activities that we see on Android devices. So those are both technologies that launched in 2015. We've started to get some preliminary results from them, but I'm really excited about where they're going to take us over the next couple of years. So we talked first about services. Now let's start talking a little bit about Android itself. I think most people, when they think about security of a device, tend to think about hardware, they tend to think about encryption, they tend to think about sandboxing. What's interesting is a huge amount of our investment, as we just talked about, is in services, right? They're above the Android platform. But that doesn't mean we aren't making similar investments in the platform itself. We have to do both of those things. We think this sort of goes to the idea of having trust and transparency. Being able to verify comes out of having those services. I think that's a unique differentiator. But it also guides us in terms of what features we're going to be putting into the core of Android. One of the first things that was implemented in Android was the idea of an application sandbox. We were very aggressive in our sandboxing. One of the key things that was done early on in Android sandboxing was recognizing that even system-level applications needed to be isolated. They needed to be separated from one another. So this is sort of a architecture diagram of what the Android sandboxing model looks like. And I would say the gray separation was something that's been in place going back to the very beginning of Android. Right? Different system applications are isolated from one another. When SE Linux was introduced in Android 4.4 a little over 2 years ago, we began to see even more isolation going down into lower levels of the stack. Root processes no longer functioned as root. They didn't have the ability to influence the entire device. So at this point, with Android 6.0, the kernel and trust zone are really the core foundation for software-level security. And then beneath that is hardware-level security. And both of those are areas that we did a lot to invest in improving security with Android 6.0. So I'll sort of talk through those. And then another thing that we focused on is looking at the top of the stack, the user, and how do we improve the user interaction with Android devices. Because it turns out the user is often the weakest link. It's not at the hardware or at the kernel. So we'll talk through some of those changes as well. So system hardening. We made a number of changes in SE Linux specifically to make the boundaries around root processes and around kernel drivers stronger. So those are talked about in the report. I'll summarize it here by pointing out that we had stronger isolation using MLS, which is multi-level security. It's a sort of key component of SE Linux and how it can isolate two different users from one another. We also added more granular filtering on device drivers. It turns out that device drivers are one of the sort of, areas that we've seen a lot of looking into exploitation on devices. Because there's a lot of code that runs in those device drivers for things like graphics processing and manipulation of audio and rendering. And so that's an area where we're using SE Linux rules to have less and less attack surface that's exposed to individual applications, so privilege escalation is going to be more difficult. One of the most prominent user-facing changes that was introduced in Marshmallow, or Android 6, was the change in the way the permissions model works. Historically, Android applications, at the time they were installed, requested a set of permissions, and the user was given the option of installing the application with those permissions or not installing the application. They had transparency, they could see what the application could do, but they didn't have control at the level of individual permission granularity. And so the change that was made in Android 6 was to give the user the ability to decide which permissions specifically an application is allowed to have. Now I want to point out something that's pretty subtle, which is, remember the Android sandbox applies to all applications, right? Pre-installed applications, system-level applications, and so there's a lot of controls that users are able to exercise even for those kinds of pre-installed applications. And you can find that either by making changes at the time an application is being installed, or you can go into settings and you can modify specific applications that were installed. So, here's a perfect example of a screenshot where Google Play Services is an application that's pre-installed on a large number of devices, but the user still has the ability to go in and decide what privacy settings they want around those applications. We think that's really important that users have those kinds of controls. So introduced in Android M, and it's something that is clearly an area that we're making good progress in providing more granular controls for users around security of their applications. Another thing that we focused on over the last several years that really came to sort of fruition in 2015 is binding hardware and hardware security to the application level security. Right? So historically, in previous platforms, or even in Android earlier in the platform, sort of hardware security was one layer, and then there was a gap that existed between that and the security model at the application layer. So what we've done with Verified Boot is tie those two things together. So there's a hardware root of trust that is put into the factory that allows the device to confirm as it's booting up every element in the boot stack until it gets to the kernel of the device. And then the kernel, of course, provides integrity for the applications. Those applications have been signed by the individual developer, and so you end up with a strong cryptographic connection across all of the code that's running on an Android device when it's out there in the wild or in the field. So that's one of the things that we want to try to do is connect all those pieces together. Verified Boot, of course, requires some fairly hardy hardware because it does do cryptographic checks throughout the boot process. And so it's something that's required for all devices, and there's a specific performance characteristic that's described in the compatibility documentation for Android, where it has to be over 50 megabits per second of AES encryption. So you'll see that number again on the next slide, actually, where we talk about encryption. Just as with Verified Boot, encryption is required with Android M to be enabled by default in covering user data that's on the main partition for all devices that have hardware that's capable of providing performance to satisfy user needs. And so we have that enabled on, we expect the vast majority of new Android devices that are going to be coming out this year and into the future. Another new feature that was introduced was the ability to encrypt the contents of your SD card. That SD card, once it's encrypted, if you take it off the device and you put it somewhere else, you're not going to be able to read the data off of it. So this is a pretty long-term commitment if you choose to encrypt the content that's on there, that you're going to use that as basically the equivalent of onboard storage, protected storage on the device. One of the really interesting developments that came about last year was increased awareness of the challenges related to identifying whether patches exist on a specific Android device. Historically, we've worked with OEMs and manufacturers of device and provided patches on a very regular cadence, but it was very difficult to tell whether a device had actually been patched. And this is true, I think, in general, that telling whether something has the right security updates is very, very challenging. Right? Version numbers are complicated. You know, especially in the Linux world, you have this kernel and that kernel, and they're both. We found that it was just too difficult. And in Android world, where you have lots of different OEMs contributing on lots of different devices with lots of different versions, it basically became impossible to tell whether something was patched. And so we made a change with Android Marshmallow, where we introduced this concept of the security patch level. And the way you use it is really straightforward. Google and its partners document publicly all of the known security issues, and when we do that, the patch level is incremented, and it's associated with a date. So you can tell that a device is patched to all known security issues as of that point in time. So you can tell without any complicated heuristics whether a device is up to date. We wanted to make that as simple as possible. The other thing that's important is that the patch level, although it was introduced first on Android 6, was also made available on earlier devices. So Android 4.4 and Android 5.0 devices may also have the patch level. They won't necessarily have all of the security features that the newer devices have, but they will have the patches for all of the issues that have been identified. It's a commitment being made by the manufacturers to deliver those patches in a timely fashion. One of the other areas that we've spent a lot of time thinking about is how to increase the use of strong authentication for users. There's a statistic that's contained in the report where we talk about adoption of fingerprint on the Nexus 5X and the Nexus 6P, the two devices that we launched from Google last year. And that use of the fingerprint scanner on those devices raised the adoption of screen locks from about the mid 50% to over 90%. Right? So increasing that usability really helped with user adoption of lock screen, which we think is critically important because devices are lost and stolen on a regular basis. And so we want to do everything we can to make that easier for users to turn on a lock screen. And I think this is the last sort of platform level feature that we'll talk about here today before we get into the data. And this is recognizing that most Android devices have an architecture that supports at the hardware level isolation of really important code from the majority of the operating system. So let me break what that means. A lot of devices have something that's either called a secure element or that's called trust zone and a TEE, where even if the operating system itself is compromised, that secure element or trust zone won't be compromised. And so we've started to use these additional hardware security primitives in a more sophisticated fashion. Specifically with Android 6.0, we began to move user authentication into that isolated area, as well as continued to provide cryptographic APIs within that environment. Right? So things like an enterprise two-party or an enterprise two-factor authentication that's based on a rotating password. You can have that, or based on a token generation. That can be contained inside the TEE or inside trust zone, a secure element, depending on the specific device. And then even if the device is compromised, there's no way to get that key out. And so that's a really important improvement for longer-term, more sophisticated use of device for authentication. So to provide a sort of high level, these are some of the features that we talked about that were introduced in Android 6.0. I'll take a moment and have a gulp of tea, and then let's talk a little bit about vulnerabilities and some of the programs that we've done there. Last year was, I think, a really important year for making progress in fixing Android vulnerabilities as quickly as possible, finding them and fixing them. We began the year by putting in place a program to provide rewards to security researchers. This was launched in June, so about halfway through the year, and by the end of the year we'd had over $200,000 that were paid out to researchers who had found issues affecting Android devices, specifically the Nexus devices, which is what we pay for in the program. They found over 105 issues, and it was a very broad set of people that were doing this research, so over 35 different researchers. We think this is really important for making sure that we're able to verify, sort of in a public fashion, the integrity and the security of the operating system. So this is a program that's similar to and sort of an extension of Google's work in providing security rewards for researchers in the past. And so far the program's been going great. We're really excited about how it's been progressing. The other thing that we did soon thereafter was we announced the need, we announced that we were going to be providing a more consistent set of patches for Nexus devices. So let me talk about what that program looks like. The first thing that we announced in August, it was actually at the Black Hat conference, is where we made this announcement. So we were going to be providing security updates for Nexus devices on a monthly basis. In addition to that, we were going to be making monthly security bulletins public. So anybody that's out there in the security research community would be able to see what those issues are and have a better understanding of them. And then the third thing we did is try to describe exactly how long we were going to provide those patches for, which is for at least 3 years from initial availability of the device. We also had a clause around if the device is sold for longer than that period of time, then we actually support it for at least 18 months after the last devices are being sold from Google Play. This is an area where historically mobile devices have not provided really clear guidance on what type of support they were going to provide from a security standpoint. This is not unique to Android, by the way. This is true for most mobile devices. There hasn't been communication about these issues. And so we wanted to set a mark for what we think is appropriate, and then we began to work with our partners to have them develop similar programs for their devices. And so after we made that announcement, we've seen similar announcements from Samsung for many of its devices, BlackBerry for the BlackBerry Crib, which also runs on Android, and we're continuing to work throughout 2015, but also now we're continuing to work with our other partners in the Android ecosystem to provide those kinds of programs for their devices as well. So in 2015, we saw hundreds of different devices that began to receive monthly updates using the patch string. Overall, there were many millions of devices that consumers chose to install those updates onto. I will say we're not there yet. Updates is still an area that we need to continue to invest more, both at Google and across the Android ecosystem. So this is an area that we'll be talking about more and more throughout this year and probably into next year as well, getting to a point where timely updates are being delivered across the Android ecosystem is something that is absolutely important for the long-term security of the ecosystem. So it's something that we're investing in pretty substantially. One of the reasons that we're doing that is because we're continuing to find issues and resolve them. And so here's a little bit of a stat dump on the set of issues that were found and fixed in Android in 2015. There were just north of, I'll add them up in my head, 155 or so issues that were resolved. I'm sure that number is spelled out in the full report. We provide patches right now for Android 4.4 and above, which is about 70% of active devices. Overall, trying to get the patches out to as many devices as possible in partnership with manufacturers and carriers. So that gives you a sense for the technology stack, right? You have patches being delivered to devices, you have the core operating system being secured, and then you have services that are on top of that. None of that speaks directly to what are we actually seeing in terms of attempts at exploitation or attempts at harming users. And so that's what we're going to talk through for the next several sections, is what's the real data look like? What's the ecosystem look like? And what are we really seeing? And this is one of the strengths that Android has from a security standpoint, is because we have these services built on top of this platform, we're actually able to see this and we can talk about it. So let's dive into the data. So this is a metric that we first started talking about in the annual report last year. This is a metric, we actually talked about it upside down, by the way. We flipped it over this year because it was a little bit confusing. Last year we talked about it as device hygiene, and the number was 99 point something, and it was the number of devices that didn't have a potentially harmful application. This year, in order to make them consistent, we flipped it over, and so this is the number of devices that had a potentially harmful application installed on them on that specific day over the last, in this instance, 15 months, going up to the end of 2015. The average was just about 0.5% for overall Android ecosystem. You can see there's some volatility. There's a spike in the sort of August going into October timeframe. We'll get into some of the details of where that came from. It's a very specific family that we reacted to, and that's the reason why you see it go down so significantly in the last couple months of the year as well. So that's a high level of what are the number of pieces of malware, potentially harmful applications that are installed onto Android devices in the ecosystem. Often the question that I get asked is, what's the most important thing that I can do? Should I install an antivirus solution? Should I buy a specific model of device? This graph is intended to show you the number one thing that you as a consumer can do, or if you are an enterprise, if you could configure your mobile device management to ensure that all devices do this, this is the most important thing you can do, which is to have your devices use Google Play as their means for installing applications. So this is the same data as on the previous slide, but broken out into two different types of devices. Those that are configured to install applications from outside of Play, and those that are installing only from inside of Play. And you can see it's literally an order of magnitude, just over 10 times difference in the overall rate of PHAs that are installed on devices outside of Play, that allow for applications outside of Play versus those that only take applications from inside of Google Play. So that's the number one thing that you can do. If you're using Android for work, there is a policy that allows you to disable through your MDM installation of applications from outside of Google Play. It's definitely something that I would recommend. If you're a consumer, you can just leave it in the default, which is that we don't allow installation of apps from outside of Google Play, and you'll be much safer. But if you choose to, you can go out and you can begin to install applications. And so the next several sections we'll talk about some of what we're seeing outside of Google Play in terms of what those install patterns look like. So let's dive into some of the year-over-year comparisons. So this first one is relatively straightforward. This is a breakdown, again, inside of Google Play of the potentially harmful applications by category. For nearly all categories, I think we have 17 categories at this point. I believe 15 of the 17 decreased in Google Play. You can see Trojan went from 0.01 to 0.02. But all of the other categories went down. The vast majority of the categories, by the way, are below 0.01% of users being affected, which is they're technically on this graph. They're just so small that you can't see them, and so they trail off to the right-hand side. We didn't think it was worth including them all in the graph. So these are the ones that are the largest in terms of their effects on users in Google Play. Overall, the number dropped in terms of install attempts between 2014 and 2015, dropped by about 40%, a little bit over 40%, I think technically about 45%. And that's reflected in a decrease in the number of users that are affected by those types of applications. Outside of Google Play, which is where we're going to focus more of our attention for the rest of the time here, we saw a slightly different story. In terms of installation attempts, we actually saw an increase in the overall installation attempts of potentially harmful applications outside of Google Play. Now, an installation attempt does not necessarily reflect that a user actually installed the application, nor does it necessarily mean that it stayed around for very long. And so when we looked at the metric from a couple slides back, we saw that overall the actual number of installs on devices stayed about the same. But there was an increase in the number of attempts to try to get applications out there. What did we see? And we'll kind of go into this in more specifics in the next couple sections. The two areas that we saw, or the three areas that we saw sort of substantial increases, one of them was around data collection. Data collection was a new category for us in 2014. So it's a little bit tricky for us to try to compare 2014 to 2015. A lot of the growth is related to it being a new category where we had stronger enforcement early in the year, and we actually saw a decline on the number of data collection applications throughout the year. But the year-over-year comparison shows some growth. Spyware went down. I'll get into that more in just a second. Trojans did increase. Both Trojan and Hostile Downloader are associated with a single campaign that I referenced earlier called Ghost Push. And so we saw, and I'll dive into this more in just a minute, a fairly significant increase in those two, and it's almost all tied to that one campaign. But I can see I'm already starting to get into specifics, so let me keep going through this where we'll actually get into details of some of the different families that are here. And there it is. So Hostile Downloader and Trojan, what are the trends outside of Google Play? It was flat for almost the entire year, but there's this big bubble in August-September timeframe where the Ghost Push family managed to dramatically increase the number of installs. And I'll talk about the specifics, but this is a case where a single campaign effectively compromised an OTA system, an over-the-air application installation system, and took advantage of that to get a large number of installs. We were able to detect that. Once we found out about the application, we were able to figure out what the installation mechanism was and sort of shut it down. And that's why you see that number drop back to its sort of pre-Ghost Push levels for the last couple months of the year. Spyware was one of the areas that we receive a lot of questions, and so I wanted to highlight this one in particular. It's also one that we talked about in the 2014 report. We continued to see steady decrease in rates of spyware on Android devices. We have a subcategory that we talk about in the full report called commercial spyware, which is things like when you know a person and they grab your phone and they install an application onto it in order to monitor you because they want to keep track of you because they know you personally, is one of the ways that commercial spyware might get used. That we've also seen a slight decrease in over the year, but it's actually a much smaller percentage of devices that are affected, so it's not included on this graph. It is in the full report, of course. SMS 3 years ago was the new hotness in terms of potentially harmful applications and malware affecting Android devices. We've seen a steady decline over the years. It's continued in 2015 as well. So we basically feel at this point it doesn't appear to be commercially viable anymore to use SMS to abuse users. And so the combination of platform level changes and the monitoring through Google services have basically eliminated that as a viable means to abuse users. And so we're seeing it continue to drop over time. Late last year, there was some concern that WAP might be the new SMS because it was something we hadn't seen at all prior to the middle of 2014. Early in the year, we did begin to see it. By the end of the year, we saw a few isolated cases. We began to track it more closely. This year, we saw a little bit in the beginning of the year, but by the second half of the year, it's basically entirely gone. Our belief is that this is not commercially viable as well. So there was some experimentation that happened, and then it went away. But it's something that we'll keep tracking, and it's something that our systems have been designed to protect against at this point. Ransomware was also something that was new in 2014, received a lot of attention. In the PC space, we've seen ransomware have incredible headlines over the last year. You may have seen discussions of hospitals having their networks taken over, financial services having some instances of that as well. In Android, the functionality of ransomware is substantially more limited. The sandboxing model makes it difficult to completely affect all of the functionality on the device. It does give the ability to manipulate content that's on your SD card, which is important, includes your photos, things like that. But it's not quite as broad in terms of its effect. The other thing is that it continues to be relatively rare. The percentage there, just to hit on it, is 0.01%. So 1 in 10,000 devices, or rather 1 in 10,000 attempted installs to a device were one that was ransomware, where there was action that was necessary to protect the user. So that gave you sort of a rundown of the various categories. There were a few events, both PHAs and vulnerabilities over the last year, that were fairly high profile, so I wanted to spend some time talking about those as well. The first was, if you look back to our 2014 report, we had a breakdown by country. We didn't do that this year, mostly because it wasn't as interesting as it was last year. Most of the countries at this point are becoming more normalized, but maybe that's something we'll return to next year. But at any rate, in the 2014 report, Russia in particular stood out as a country where there was a much higher risk of users installing potentially harmful applications. And so one of the things that we did was change our process for interacting with Russian devices. It was a two-phased approach. The first phase was we increased the rate at which we were scanning the devices in Russia. That almost immediately began to show a reduction in potentially harmful applications on Russian devices. The second thing that we did was we identified certain families of potentially harmful application that were very difficult for us to remove. And we made some changes there as well. One set of them were difficult to remove because they had device administrator privileges. And so we improved our tooling in Verify Apps to be able to remove apps that had device administrator. The other thing that we saw was some of these had very good social engineering around them, where they told the user, even though there's a warning, you should still install it. And they sort of trained the user to go through that process. And so for those, we just started removing them completely. No more warnings to the user, just block it. And so that's one of the ways that we were able to drive that down. This doesn't show the entire year. I should have included the entire year. That downward trend continues through the entire year. And at this point, Russian devices they're actually a little bit cleaner, I think, but certainly in the neighborhood of overall worldwide average. And that's our goal, is to identify outlier groups and drive them back to the median so that users have a consistent level of protection sort of as a baseline across the Android ecosystem, and then we can use that to improve the whole ecosystem overall. The other family that was very prominent, I've already mentioned it once or twice, is something called Ghost Push. Incredibly effective in terms of distribution and attempted distribution. this graph it shows that for a period of time, almost half of the installation of applications from outside of Google Play in certain regions of the world were associated with a single family of potentially harmful application. Worldwide, it was almost a third of all installs that we were seeing outside of Google Play. So, this goes back to the difference between Google Play and outside of Google Play. The family was able to find a service that did promotion of applications and installation of those applications that had been promoted, and they took advantage of that. And they used that path to basically pay for installs of their potentially harmful application onto large numbers of devices, and then use that to sort of grow their overall capability. It was targeted primarily at India, Indonesia, and Central Asian countries because that's where that installation and application promotion service was prominent. So they used that as their foothold to begin to build the network. Once we identified this and began to react to it, we were able to shut it down very quickly. And so you see that drop off in terms of the number of installs. There's a similar, or rather, that drop off in sort of the November timeframe, or when is that? That is like the second week in October, about 10 to 14 was roughly when that was. That steep drop was a result of us both changing our rules inside of our services, but also beginning to do outreach to the company that was promoting applications. So we were able to make that change and work with them to begin to clean up the situation. There were a couple of other situations that took place in the Android ecosystem that were very prominent. Interestingly enough, none of the rest of these had what I would argue a meaningful impact on actual user security in terms of exploitation take place. The first one is stage fright. Stage fright was sufficiently exciting for those of us in the Android security space that I busted out my tester model paints, and with my son, we painted these little robots here in the stage fright logo. Right, lots of visibility on this issue, lots of excitement around it. There was a demonstration of exploitation, but ultimately, those exploitations pretty much only took place in the lab. We did not see any exploitation of a real user device. Our services give us the ability to view, billions of connections to different services throughout the world. We see connections through safe browsing. We look for potential exploitation of stage fright there. We see that locally through Verify Apps and through SafetyNet. I've been talking with lots of partners in the security space about whether they've seen exploitation. At this point, nobody's seen it taking place against real devices in the wild. We do see samples. We do see sort of demonstrations by security companies, but that's it. So the evidence seems to suggest at this point that the combination of diversity in the Android ecosystem and exploit mitigation that exists in the platform and in our applications made exploitation sufficiently difficult that the amount of time it took to begin to roll out updates to the ecosystem kept users safe. Obviously, we're going to continue working on increasing the rate that we can get out updates. We're going to continue to increase the exploit mitigations. There's a lot of work that's going into Android N right now. The next version that we're working on, that's in preview right now, and we're going to continue working on making this even more difficult. But the good news is we didn't see any actual exploitation at this point. What we did see in terms of exploitation was some old vulnerabilities still being exercised. If you hearken back to, I think it was in the August timeframe, maybe July timeframe, there was a company that builds exploitation tools and then licenses them to customers. We suspect governments and intelligence agencies is who they sell to. They were broken into and had their tools exposed. Didn't include any 0 days against Android, but it did include a working exploit against an older WebView vulnerability. And it turns out when we look back at our data, we were able to see some examples of that actually being exploited against real user devices. Relatively small number. The number of sort of observations that we saw is, I can count them on 1 or 2 hands out of billions of different connections that we've seen. So we did see some evidence that it was being used, but not a lot. And then the other area that we have seen sort of ongoing investment by security research communities in local privilege escalation, trying to gain root on a device to be able to gain better control on the device. Last year, Ping Pong Root was the new root level vulnerability that was demonstrated. We saw that incorporated into a number of rooting tools that allowed users to gain elevated capabilities on their devices. We did see some being used in what we consider to be Trojans or potentially harmful applications, but not a lot. So that's something that we're keeping an eye on. It's one of the reasons that verified boot is so important, by the way, is so that in the future, where there's exploitation of these kind of privilege escalations, there's a guarantee that a Trojan isn't able to maintain persistence. So that's one of the reasons that we invest in these different technologies, right? We have services to be able to monitor, be able to prevent installation. We have things like verified boot to be able to prevent maintenance of a capability on the device. And then, of course, we have the sandboxing that is what was there to begin with. So to summarize at a high level, we invested a lot in both platform technology and security services. The scope of those give us the ability to view what's going on across the ecosystem, as well as to make sure that we're investing effectively. The year looked, from an exploitation standpoint and from a potentially harmful application standpoint, remarkably similar to 2014. There were a little bit of increase outside of Google Play in terms of the number of attempted installations that we saw. There were 2 cases where there was families of related applications that got to be fairly substantial, but we were able to then curb them. One of them Ghost Push and the other in Russia. And then in terms of exploitation of vulnerabilities, quite a bit of media attention, but not a lot of actual exploitation. So that's what we saw in 2015. We're a couple months into 2016, and we're beginning to think about what we'll be talking about next year. So far, just no big changes from what we saw in 2015 either, but we'll be continuing to work on making improvements that are guided by what we learned, so that we can do an even better job protecting users next year. So when we started, I was told there were 200-some questions, and we'll start now and see how many of them we have. I'm grabbing another computer that has questions on it. All right. First question, will this video be available for replay later? Someone tells me yes, it will be. So yes, it will be. And I don't know where, but I imagine we'll send an email out to folks that were registered, and they'll be able to then forward it. We'll probably post it somewhere that you can find it as well. Next question here. How will a containerized PIM solution be user-friendly in 2016? How are Google doing updates, patches, security updates on Android for WorkOS integrated environment? Excellent. Does anybody know what PIM means? I don't know what PIM means.
Private information management.
Oh, okay. I still don't understand this question. I apologize. I'll skip the question. I can answer the second half of the question, which is about updates, patches, and security updates. It's an area that we're investing really heavily in. We changed our process in the middle of last year to move to a monthly update process. What that has done is made it much more predictable for manufacturers and carriers in terms of when issues would need to be fixed and what the delivery schedule will look like. So we've already started to see a lot more devices moving towards a regular cadence for delivering security updates. Quite a few of them are on a monthly cadence, similar to Nexus. BlackBerry is doing that. A number of the Samsung devices are doing that as well. Some of them are likely to be on a bi-monthly or even a quarterly basis, which will be a significant improvement from the status quo, where they'd be very regularly providing those kinds of updates. The security patch string gives us the ability to track this, and so we've been watching that as it's being adopted by devices. Now, security patch string was only introduced in December, right, which is just 3 months ago. So as of this report, we didn't have any data to share. As of right now, our data is just beginning to come in, but I expect that we'll provide more details on what that looks like later in the year. Third question, what is Google doing to help with the SS7 vulnerability? Yeah, this was really interesting. For people who don't have context, a couple days ago, Karsten Knowles did a nice demonstration. He's a researcher in Germany. Did a nice demonstration of vulnerabilities in the signaling layer that's actually carrier-controlled networking. And it ended up, I think it was on 60 Minutes, so really aimed at the hardcore security community in terms of describing the vulnerability. But it received a lot of attention. From the Android standpoint, we've never trusted the network. It's always been our assumption that the network itself is not trustworthy. That's why we rely on, for the Google applications, SSL. It's why we encourage the use of cryptography at the application layer. And then the assumption is any communication could be intercepted, but that the interception of that is not something that's protected. So I expect that at the layers that control networking and signaling, there's a lot of people that are looking at this issue. It's not something that we've made a change to Android in order to address it, because frankly, it's below Android, and our assumption has always been that the network is not trustworthy. So the next question here is, how are you able to do Android for Work updates as an integrated part of the OS instead of as a separate app from Google Play? So I think what this is getting at is there are a couple of areas in the operating system where we've identified potential security risks, and we've migrated that functionality into applications so that they could be updated. One of them was in Android 5.0, where WebView, which is the technology used to render web pages inside of the context of an application, that became an application supported by Google, supported by the Chrome team. We update that every 6 weeks. It used to be a core part of the operating system, and you can still build an Android device using the open source code provided by the Chrome team, but for most Android devices that have the Google applications on them, that's something that's provided by Google and updated by Google. We've done the same thing with OpenSSL and some of the security APIs. There are parts of the device, like the kernel, that can't be updated by Android or by the Google team. They're too specific, and so the manufacturers of the device have to do the updates. And we're working with them to make that a more efficient process, more predictable process. But we're not going to be able to move those into the core, into an application level. Simply not possible. I know security is ongoing. Innovation and improvements. How do you compare Android security to competitor security so far? There's a couple different benchmarks that I think of. The first one that I think about is the other devices that a user might use. Right? What is the device that you trust the most? And I think in a corporate environment, you have a variety of other platforms, and Android is likely to be the most secure of those platforms. Frankly, compared to desktop platforms, compared to any of those other platforms, I think Android and the other mobile operating systems in general are far and away superior to the technology that we're using for most of our information processing in the enterprise at this point. When you look at companies, government agencies, hospitals, financial institutions being compromised, those compromises are coming through legacy operating systems running out-of-date applications. And so for them, the faster they can move to mobile, the better off they're going to be. And I say that regardless of which mobile operating system you choose. They are all superior. Now, in the mobile space, I think there's two components that I like to think about. The first is element of trust. And I mentioned trust and transparency, right? Trust and verify. When it comes to trust, Android is more diverse than other platforms. Within the Android ecosystem, there are some devices that have built trust from the ground up into them. I'm thinking about the Nexus devices, I'm thinking about Samsung Knox devices, I'm thinking about the BlackBerry Priv, and a number of other devices where the core trust stack is intact and is uniform across those devices. There are, of course, more Android devices, and there's a diversity of them. And for those, you don't have the same level of trust. But I think over time you will begin to have that level of trust. With Marshmallow, we began to have all of those building blocks in place, the hardware root of trust and encryption being there. So I think they're going to end up being equivalent across most of the major mobile operating systems. I believe trust and hardware security is going to commoditize, frankly, across all the mobile devices, because it's pretty uniform. Where Android is highly differentiated is two areas. One is in services, because Google has such strength in services, and we have been thinking about the diversity of our ecosystem and keeping an open ecosystem. And so we've really invested heavily in services and being able to analyze and understand the security information that's being generated on 1 billion+ devices every single day. And that's something that we're uniquely invested in. I think that's really, really valuable, and it's going to make the platform stronger over time. The other thing that I think makes Android stronger over time relative to more closed mobile platforms is the openness of our ecosystem. The work that Samsung has done on Knox, for example, is really, really impressive. They've done a great job thinking about how to incorporate hardware and monitoring and adding integrity checks based on the different pieces of hardware that are on the device. They're ahead of the field in that. The work that other teams have done across the Android system in building more robustness into their devices has also been really substantial. So I think over time, the fact that there are multiple different parties that are contributing into Android, the fact that we've embraced the security research community is going to give us leaps and bounds of innovation that just won't exist in other places. And so I think that's where I think both right now for mini Android devices, but also in the long term, we're going to see really strong differentiation, and we're going to be a great place. So I was told to go till about 11, which the little clock in front of me says 11:01. So I got through about 10 or 15 questions. I would encourage, if you have more questions, feel free to chat about them online. We'll be sort of keeping an eye out there and try to get an eye on that. Again, the report, I know it's long, but I think it's a pretty good read. So I would encourage you to take a look. And with that, thank you all very much, and see you around.